I want to welcome you to the most remarkable journey you will ever take. We have long wondered about the mysteries behind the resurrection of the dead, or the transformation of human to divine. We have asked ourselves these questions. Why am I human? Where are we going as a human race? Why did God create us? In these next 26 weeks, we're going to learn the answers to these questions. We're also going to learn about the powers that lie within us, that creativity that enables us to prophesy, to heal, and to discern. Our sailing vessel that will take us from earth to the heavens is known and called the Nautilus. If you remember, the sea creature is one which always closes and seals off its chambers as it outgrows it and builds a new one. And we must do the same thing, for we must cease being what we are in order to become something different. And like the Nautilus, we must leave behind our old ideas and concepts. So please join me on this very wondrous journey. I'm your hostess, Elizabeth MacDonald Burrows. Welcome to another world aboard the Nautilus as we go from earth to heaven. We left off last week with healing of others. But before we continue with that and finish it, I want to talk about what we're going to cover in these next few weeks. One of the things that is very important to us is to realize that we have to change the way we think. We cannot just do this by getting up in the morning and willing ourselves to say, all right, today I'm going to think nothing but good thoughts. I'm going to ride herd on everything that I think. It'll never last more than 5 minutes or 10 minutes or something like that. And the next thing you know, a little wispy thought dribbles kind of through the mind. And this leads then to a chain reaction. And the next thing we find ourselves perhaps thinking of negative things or thinking about something negative that happened to us. It's very hard to live with a positive attitude in a world where many people are negative. We're negative because we work hard. We struggle for existence. We suffer pain and sorrow and anguish. We have disappointments in life. So therefore, it's very difficult for us to realize that these things happen to us for a reason that we have set in motion someplace, sometime, somewhere, something that is going to bring to us this sorrow. And what I mean by this is we say, but I didn't set in motion my mother's death. We know that all life is going to die, just as it is born. We know that someday, somewhere, every one of us must lose a loved one. And so this takes us into that great world that goes beyond corporeal boundaries. What happens to our loved ones when they are taken away from us? No, we didn't send them away. We didn't kill them, but they're gone. And we grieve. And I think death is so beautiful and so wonderful. And I think that for any of us to be able to take that last journey with someone who is going to enter in the world beyond mortal boundaries is a very special experience. As many people who are sick struggle for life, it is an intimate moment for them, or an intimate time as they struggle between life and death. So we want to take a look at that, because we should not suffer over something that is so natural. something which we know so little about and yet know so much about. When I put it that way, I'm reminded of how we will go to a grave and grieve for one that we have lost, all the time knowing that they're somewhere in a heaven with angels, meeting with loved ones. And so we have to ask ourselves, these attachments that we have for people, places, and things that bring us so much sorrow, is it because we do not understand? So we are first going to go on with our world of healing, and then we're going to go on beyond mortal boundaries and take a look at what happens when we take off our bodies and we're suddenly faced with a non-embodiment. I always take great offense, when someone talks about ghosts. I cannot imagine my mother and my father, who may transition a long time ago, I cannot imagine them as ghosts. They're just people without casements. And that's what we are as we journey between lives and continue to climb this tremendous ladder that we hope will take us to the stars. Along with this, in the changing of our mind and how we think, not only in understanding those portals that go beyond us, but we need to peruse some of the ancient wisdom. We need to be careful about the material that we watch on television, the movies that we go to, the books that we read. For instance, the newspaper is not necessarily the most healthy thing for us. I like to know what's going on in the world, and I don't think anyone stays more abreast of worldly events, perhaps, than I do. But I also know that when we read of crime and violence, which is such a small percentage of the things that take place upon this earth, we don't read very often about how people are rescued in floods and earthquakes. Yes, we hear about it. We may see it on television, but it's there for a day or two and then it is gone. And in its place are all these terrible things. If we were to publicize the good that man does, there wouldn't be enough newspapers, nor would there be one big enough to contain them all. We seem, for some reason, to be fascinated by these things which we consider in news to be bad. For some reason there is an attraction from us to them, and we do not realize how this is triggering in us our fears and our concerns. We read about a robbery in the neighborhood. We go out and we buy a gun. Every time we hear a little noise in the house, suddenly we're frightened and we reach for a gun. And maybe someday, by accident, because we think it's a burglar or something, we may shoot someone that we really care for. And so this builds in us fear. And so we try to move away from those things that are so frightening and to start looking at the more positive things in life. And one of the tools that we have, of course, or several of the tools, one is music. Great music, not rock music that stirs the more primitive senses of ourselves, but beautiful and great classical music. And telling someone who likes rock music they should study classical music or learn to understand it would be like telling someone who can barely read to read War and Peace, which puts many a person to sleep. But that we can train ourselves. We can train ourselves by reaching out to a music that is a higher caliber for those moments to bring us peace. We're not saying that those that are really fond of hard rock and who are not going to give it up even if I ask them to, we're only asking them to reach out and to include a bit of better music amongst the music that they listen to. And so we can look at great composers like Beethoven and Chopin and Schubert and We can go and study the great art pieces of Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo. We can peruse the philosophies of antiquity going back for 6,000 years. I admit that sometimes the discourses of Plato can put us to sleep, but Pythagoras may or may not. I find, of course, that Pythagoras was witty. He wrote in allegory. In writing in allegory, he leaves the mind the opportunity to try to ferret what he is really saying. And of course, Pythagoras was knowledgeable in music and in science, or the science of mathematics, as well as he was in philosophy. So we're going to be taking a look at Beethoven's letters as they were translated from his diary, and find out his opinion, personal opinions of things like relating to God and other things. We're going to look into the notebooks of Leonardo da Vinci, which has been translated, to see how he looks at these things. We want to also take a look at some of the philosophies. One of them will be Pythagorean philosophy. We'll look at some of the religions. We'll probably look and touch at the edge of Buddhism, Hinduism, and perhaps Muslim if we have time, because we only have a few more weeks left before this series will be completed. And take a look and see our commonality. Because if we are truly a seeker of God and truth, then we will find the commonality throughout the music we listen to, the philosophy we read, and through every religion of the world. And when this happens, we can step beyond those boundaries we have imposed upon ourselves and realize that everyone is going the same path, regardless of what we call it. So we're going to take a look at these things, and we hope that you will enjoy these next few weeks. But for right at the moment, we're going to return to that world of self-healing. We want to remember that when we're getting ready to heal someone, our ability to align ourselves with the cosmic ocean, in other words, with God, is the power that is going to generate for us that great healing, generate that great healing which could and can and so often produces the miracles. And as we do this healing, we want to take, when we take someone to heal, we don't want to rush it. We want to prepare them for the healing as much as we want to heal. I like to put on music, and the music that I use to bridge the gap between the great classical music and that of what is commonly played in the outside world is considered probably as New Age meditative music, with composers as Tony O'Connor and Kotaro, certainly Herb Ernst, and we've mentioned them before on this show and on other shows. This music bridges those two worlds. For instance, Herb Ernst was a classical pianist who put to the synthesizer the beautiful expression of nature and forgiveness and the sea. Tony O'Connor in Australia, who ventures out into the outback and creates his music to correlate with what he sees, with the mountains, with the water, with the rainforests. They bring to us the same comprehension or feeling that they have as they compose and write the music. So I like to take a tape that is nothing but music, where there's no talking, and to put it on, and then to guide the person in imagery to the scenes that are taking place in the music. So we can pretend, for instance, that perhaps we're listening to Tony O'Connor's platinum recording called The Mariner. which takes us to sea. And there aboard an ancient ship we sail toward this mystic land that you might call heaven and I might call beyond mortal boundaries, where we see angel spirals and where we know that the journey of our life is over. So I like to guide this person to see these scenes and to find themselves aboard the ship and to focus upon the mariner, who of course is God, because God is the mariner of all of our souls. And it is He that is the power that moves us to want to be more tomorrow than we are today. So now that this person is stilled and quiet, and I like them to lay comfortably on a table that is just about waist high, where I don't have to bend over in order to do the healing. And I like to cover them as we would cover ourselves with something that is warm and comfortable, because I ultimately want them to feel that they're either in the arms of the sea or in the wings of the cloud or the breath of the wind. Because if we can get their minds centered on such beautiful things, and that they will journey in their mind to God as you journey to God in your mind, then the two of you can come together in that one burst of great consciousness. And then so often the miracles, if they are destined to be, can take place. And always when I'm healing others, I still pray for their healing, leaving it though within the power or will of the Heavenly Father. And as we talked about last week, I always know when a person might receive a miraculous healing or does receive one. I also know if there are lessons that they have to learn by their illness. And if there are lessons for them, I then try to teach them self-healing. I try to help them to understand what has brought them this illness and to help them to help themselves. Because I cannot be with them every single day to give a healing treatment. And it may be that in chronic conditions or serious conditions that a number of healings will have to be done in order for that person to become well. And if that person doesn't care enough about themselves to change their diet, to try to work in some manner toward preserving themselves and willing to learn self-healing, then it isn't likely that I'm going to do a healing with them either. I can remember one of my young assistants named Cheryl, who traveled with me, being so upset one day because there was a chipmunk who was very ill. I mean, the chipmunk had caught his little head in a trap trying to get some cheese, and they brought him in unconscious and his little head all twisted. And so I got a box and a warm blanket and a little warm covering for him and began to heal him. I'm kneeling by this box doing a healing on this chipmunk, and I remember my assistant saying to me, she said, "You will heal a chipmunk, but you won't heal a human." And I said, "But it is because the chipmunk has been injured by what a human has put out. This trap is man-made. This chipmunk can't help himself. A human being can help themselves. And since we did this to this creature, I feel that he is entitled to this healing." And of course, it was one of those miracles, and I realized as the chipmunk began to regain consciousness and life force come back into the body that he had been hungry. So I sat by the box there for a while and fed him one sunflower seed at a time, and by afternoon he was up and he was gone. And That's the way I personally felt about it. Or we have, like, in a situation like where a daughter came to me and said, I want you to heal my mother. And I said, but your mother came and talked to me a number of months ago, and I told her there were changes that she had to make in her diet because she was cancer conducive, meaning that her skin tissue showed me that there was a potentiality of cancer. And I had suggested at the time that she go to a medical doctor and be checked over very, very carefully. Well, when they checked her over, of course, they found cancer. And I had recommended that she make the changes in her diet, bring in healthy food, to exercise, to get fresh air, to think positive and beautiful things. And her daughter said, but my mother won't do that. And I said, and I won't heal your mother. Because her mother was in a condition where she was strong enough to do these things for herself. And if we don't have more of an interest in our life than that, we should not take this great power and use it or dissipate it into trying to help someone who is going to go back. It isn't I'm selfish, I want you to understand that, but they will go back to the same way of life that they did before you healed them. They'll go back to their drinking, or they'll go back to eating their rich foods. They'll go back to their double lattes 3 times a day. And if they're going to do that, they're going to be in trouble again very soon. Either it will be the same condition, or because that condition was thwarted because we healed it, it will manifest as some other physical condition. And perhaps that one will be worse than the one that we healed. So we don't accomplish anything or a great deal by healing someone who's going to go on with the same way of life. We have to be willing to make some changes in our life if we want a healing to take place, and if we want that healing to continue to work for us, and so that we can have a quality life. Every single human being should have a quality life. We should not have such things as Alzheimer's disease. We should be able to not have cancer and things like this. That we can have, most of us, barring genetic weaknesses, most of us have the opportunity to really have a quality life, to have our minds, to have our body, to have our strength, to bring forth our creativity in the last years of our life. And to not be able to do this is so sad. I watch elderly people, and I have a deep compassion for them because of sometimes the routine life that they are relegated to simply because they are older. And with me, I think of the exciting life and full life that I have, even though my years pass on also. So I like to make certain that the person that I'm going to heal is going to make some changes in their life. And so sometimes I may heal first, and along with it I may recommend herbs and homeopathic or homeopathic. Or other times I may recommend that they do some purification of the body for 3 months, and then I'll do some healing and let them make an effort toward bringing back to themselves a healthier life. Remember, I did this to a woman one time, made a recommendation of some dietary changes, and in this case she did make those changes, and 3 months later she called me and said, I won't need the healing because I'm well. The problems I were having are now gone. So a lot of things can be taken care of by us being willing to make these changes, not only in what we eat, but in what we think. So we now have our person who is here on the table and is going to be healed. We are going to talk to them, or I'm going to talk to them as if there were really someone here, and as if I were really healing someone, so that you can have the opportunity to see the process that I go through in creating a healing. I still the mind, and I always lay the hands. If that person is here, I realize that they can be in New York and we can still do this healing. But whenever possible, the laying of the hands is so helpful because it helps us to focus our mind upon what we're doing. So by the laying of the hands, with the music playing and we hear the sound of the sea, listen to the sound of the sea. And in the eye of your mind, look as far as you can across the ocean toward the horizon where the sea and the sky meet. Let us feel that we're aboard a sailing ship and that we're putting away the cares of the world and shore begins to dissipate. We hear only the lapping of the waves. We are moving slowly through the sea, not quite at full sail yet, but a journey of peace, a journey of light. And at the bow of our sailing ship stands the silent mariner. He is taking us to our true home, into the light of immortality and the light of healing. And we feel ourselves so light, so relaxed, and now we have reached that point where the sea and the sky meet. And suddenly our ship is filled with light. And we sail into the very core of light itself. And all around us, there is nothing but the light and power of God. And at this point then, I began to breathe in this tremendous power. And so because I don't have someone here, I will lift my hands up that I might send forth whatever power through the set that may be of help to someone out there. Each of you imagine yourself surrounded by light, the sea behind you, and the Spirit of God enfolding you. Breathe in the Spirit of God. Exhale and allow it to flow through the person that you're healing. Breathe in. Exhale. Feel your oneness with God. Feel His Spirit flowing through you, and with it the power of the stars and creation. Oh Heavenly Father, may your healing power flow through me, through those that have a need, and all that you may allow to pass through me will go to those who have a need. And I pray, if it be and I will, that there be miracles for those who believe. Thank you, Father, for the opportunity to heal, for your power which has been given to those who have a need. I like the person to lay silently and very quietly for a while after the healing. And then I like them to go home and go to sleep for a while, if they possibly can. Because once again, if the healing has been powerful, it will continue to work through the hours and days that follow. Each day beginning to decrease as it is used up more and more by the body. We have in us this power. We are all healers. We must never doubt our capability to help others and to help ourselves. And to remember that each and every one of us do possess all the powers that we have talked about in these past weeks. The power of prophecy, the power of discernment, and the power of healing. And I would wish, because of this, that your lives become better and fuller. Now as we continue on, we're going to journey in the world beyond mortal boundaries. Here again, we run into something that makes truth sometimes more strange than fiction. We like to horrify ourselves on Halloween with ghost stories and hobgoblins. We watch murder mysteries, ghost stories and sci-fi. We may go to movies that terrorize us, or at least make us quite frightened. We will do these things. How much of it, we believe, is personal? But nonetheless, there are no such things as ghosts. Because when we leave embodiment, we are still more alive, but very much alive. I consider it more alive than we ever were upon earth. One of the things that happened, and I will explain that in the early years of my own initiation, I was allowed to visit with my mother and father who had made their transition, had stepped beyond mortal boundaries. I was taken by Angelic Kingdom to where we go when we make transition, not once, but several times. I was allowed to visit hospitals and restaurants and cities and things like this, to find that the world that rests beyond here is really not so different than our world here. That the world as we think of in terms of the other side or heaven or wherever actually interpenetrates this one. I kind of describe it as like a light filling a room. The thing is, we do not see in their world. Their world can somewhat from time to time make out our world, but we cannot see into theirs because their body isn't dense enough. I always tell people, if your weight bothers you, wait, because when you make transition, you'll be down to about 3/4 of an ounce. I think it's about a half ounce or 3/4 of an ounce that science has been able to not account for in the process of someone departing from life into that stage we have called death in the past. So 3/4 of an ounce isn't very much. So we would be invisible to those of physical form. However, strangely enough, when we're in semi-light, semi-material form, which is our true self, which is really our true bodies, the body we live in all the time, the one that incarnates back into embodiment, when we dwell in it and we're on the other side, we feel as solid to one another as we feel here. Because something that weighs 3/4 of an ounce is solid to something that weighs 3/4 of an ounce. So the misnomer that we die, that we really die, should be taken from our understanding and comprehension, because we add such terrible connotation. And with this connotation we add not only fear of our own death, but we also grieve so for those who have died. And nothing, as far as I'm concerned, nothing could be further from the truth, because as time went on, I developed inner sight and was able to see in actually 3 worlds. I did not try to visit with my mother and my father, simply because I wanted to keep my consciousness in the realm of the angels and to work with that realm. I didn't want to be caught in the lower realms. But nevertheless, my mother and father came to me many times, and I remember one time I had made apple dumplings, and I was in the kitchen and I was talking to someone. I was actually in a parsonage when I was in the ministry. And I said, you know, my mother used to make the most wonderful transparent cinnamon sauce. I said, she actually made 2 sauces, and one of them I know how to make, but the other one I don't, the clear cinnamon sauce. And I said, of course, she is deceased now, and the recipe is with her. Within 15 minutes, my mother was there with my Aunt Rhoda and my Uncle Will and another member of the family. I think there were 4 of them. My mother came over and gave me the directions for making the sauce that I had been talking about. And I still make that sauce to this day. So it's hard for me to conceive that death exists. But anyway, in the early years, when in the very early part of my initiations, having to experience so that I would learn and to know and to understand the process of death and dying, I went to the other side. My mother had been over about 4 years at that time, and my father had been over less than a year. And so, and my second mother, which really was not a second wife of my father, but the woman that lived across the street that let me do all the things my parents wouldn't let me do, her name was I called her Mother Bohan. She too had been over a little less than a year. I was taken to meet with my mother. She met me at the end of a long corridor, and we walked the corridor to where she and several family members, I mean, life goes on very much the same as here. Loved ones are with loved ones, families with family, and one by one they're welcomed over there just as we welcome a newborn baby over here. So she, of course, my mother looked wonderful. She had died with hardening of the arteries, senile, so infirmed, and then here she was. She looked about 40 years old. She was wearing her hair very much as she had worn it during that time. She had wonderful color, and there were no illnesses. She took me then to my father, and I knelt beside him. He was still in a semi-unconscious state, and even though he had been over for almost a year. And I knelt, and he didn't recognize me any more then than he would have had I visited him on earth. We always think that as soon as someone takes the body off, away goes pain and suffering, and to some degree that's true. The pain does not go. But if someone makes their transition and they have been senile for a long time, or they've had Alzheimer's disease for a very long time, they don't realize that they've crossed over. And so the result is they often stay right in the nursing homes or in the homes with the family members, just like they did before, without any awareness or realization. And it is for this reason that they have, I refer to them as rescue teams. I have no other name for them. And as watching, I always watch Touched by an Angel, and she served, as you know, on rescue, so therefore I kind of call it rescue myself. But there are people on the other side, many of them doctors and nurses, that come for people here and help them to and to take care of them, so they don't wander around from hither, thither to yon without any awareness that they have crossed over from mortal to the more immortal patterns. And so the pain, yes, is gone, but consciousness doesn't clear itself quite that quickly. And so my father had, of course, been senile for quite some time before transition, and enough time had not passed yet that he had yet regained the full consciousness. It wasn't long, though. I think it was a few months later, and it was such a joyous thing. I walked in to lecture into an auditorium, and I looked over, and there was my father sitting on the third row of lecture hall, and he was just so proud, and I was so glad that I could give my father and mother the joy of knowing what I did with my life, that all the elocution lessons that my mother had had killed chickens and taken eggs and things like this in order to pay for, that I had used them, and I had used them for the good of mankind. And so it made me so happy that I could make them so proud of me, because so many things that happened to me happened after, of course, they had departed from earth. There are, like, for instance, there are bars there. Not bars where you can get inebriated, because ether cannot intoxicate ether. It takes a chemical reaction. But because a person may be an alcoholic here upon earth, they still have the same habitual patterns that made them an alcoholic on earth. Those still exist. The alcoholism, insofar as the body being intoxicated, no. That doesn't exist. But what does exist is the causes that made them an alcoholic upon earth. And so imagine the suffering that an alcoholic goes through when they cannot drink. They may go to a bar and they may have a glass of ether spirits, but nothing happens. They cannot escape consciousness. They cannot go to that high oblivion that they did while they lived upon earth. And so imagine how difficult it is for them to have to face a reality. Because after all, alcoholism, of course, like many drugs and things like this, are addictive. And a person may become a social drinker long enough to become addicted. But at the same time, why do we have to drink socially? Why can we not be just as happy and enjoy one another just as much on sparkling grape juice as we can upon a glass of alcohol? So even a social drinker drinks a drink to relax, drinks a drink to be happier, to be more animated, to not have to deal with life. In other words, we should be able to be so excited about life and enjoy life so much that it in itself is an intoxication. But that isn't it for most people, because we are not aware of the potentiality in us. We are not aware of our continuity. We're not aware of this great seed of genius that is inside of each one of us, just waiting to be born. And all we have to do with this seed of genius is to plant it in a fertile field. And it's nature, just like putting a seed in the ground, and suddenly it will sprout and grow. So the seed of genius in us, we'll give it a chance, put it in a fertile field, it'll grow. And it grows easily, not difficult. So we're not aware of these things. So we see only our misery and our unhappiness, and most of all, our loneliness. I do think that loneliness and being alone is probably one of the greatest sufferings of humanity. And so we choose something to make us forget about it, or something that makes us feel a little happier and can cope or deal with. And then the next thing you know, of course, we've gone into addiction. Whether it's drug or alcohol doesn't really make any difference. And the same thing is applicable on the other side with drug addiction. They still have the same things in them that made them a drug addict on earth. The same thing. So the very same problems that we had that made us this way is going to come back in embodiment with us. And we can't think for one moment that we can while away our lives with 30 years of hard drinking and then suddenly on our knees in the last minute ask for forgiveness and not have a price to pay. I'm not saying that we are not forgiven. God does not ever have to forgive. He forgave us when He created us. He knows that we're human and we're going to get in trouble. And He lets us learn our lessons. But at the same time, He still doesn't ever dislike us because we failed somewhere, someplace, or fell down and we didn't get a good grade in school, or because we're an alcoholic, or because we killed someone. He doesn't stop loving us because of this. But we do have to learn the lesson from it, and we do have to make the atonement. So you can imagine what happens when a person commits suicide. I remember picking up a young girl who was walking. She's about 12 years old. I picked her up. And the reason I did is I was afraid that someone who would pick her up who would not be like I am, and sadly, she might be raped or killed or something like that. So I picked her up and I had her in the car with me, and she doesn't say anything. She's kind of in her, scrunched up in her seat, and I'm just driving along. And finally, remember the power of discernment and the power of prophecy, to know what's in a person's mind, to be able to perceive it, can be so helpful sometimes. So I just looked over at her and I said, "Oh, so you're planning on taking your life? That is ridiculous." She looked at me in such a stunned way. And then I went on to explain to her how if she took her life, then she would have to live again. And she would face the circumstances that had caused her to take her life. And then suddenly, somewhere, sometime at the age of 12 or 13, she would be denied life when she wanted to live. I remember one of my young students who was about 17 or 18 years old telling me that she remembers her last death so well. She said, I was on a pioneer, and she said, just as I was a young girl about 12 years old, and just as I was being dragged under the wheels of the wagon, she said, I heard a voice saying to me, this is an atonement for such and such a life. So we can't take our life without paying a price for it. We can't take the life of another without paying a price. And giving our own life up because we've stood in front of a judge and jury who has taken our life is not alone sufficient. We still owe the person a life that we took. So there is no possible way that we can prevent ourselves from having to descend again into embodiment, to pay that debt, so they become our invalid daughter or alcoholic husband or our very ill wife, and we have to take care of them because of that. So life going to the world beyond does not remove what we are. It doesn't change us. We don't suddenly fly with angel wings hither, thither, and yon, but rather we have clarity, though, to see better the mistakes that we made in life. And I don't think a one of us ever is drawn to embodiment again that doesn't, we're going to do it right this time, and then once we're sunk into oblivion and darkness, we then began to forget and go on and make the same mistakes that we've done before because we haven't corrected them. And that's what's so miraculous about this transformation of human to divine, about as known as the resurrection of the dead, is we are allowed to correct these errors so that we do not have to bring them in to embodiment again. Let us think about what happens to people on an in an airplane crash. 350 people killed all at once. And we think of our sorrow. All these mothers and fathers and lovers and wives and husbands waiting for their loved ones that on that plane where everyone was killed, their grief and their sorrow. We've watched them through the media of television when these great disasters have happened to us. But do we ever consider what those people who were killed on that airplane, what about them? They don't get to see their loved ones. If they hold their wife in their arms or their husband in their arms again, the husband and wife cannot feel them. The husband and wife cannot see them. So here suddenly, all these people may be going home for the Christmas holidays, and they're denied going home. And suddenly here they are. And we think only about our own grief, but we don't think about the struggle of people who so suddenly their life is terminated. They had plans, the same plans we had. So there are such things, doctors and nurses. On the angelic kingdom, they're very aware of these disasters within minutes, and immediately they send angelic beings to those disasters to comfort, to help them to cope and to understand. And so when you've lost a loved one, you have to know that they're taken care of on the other side. And when you make your transition, who knows, maybe you'll want to dedicate your life to helping others. But for now, we're going to have to leave this voyage aboard the Nautilus and continue with life after death in our next episode. Thank you for this wonderful adventure.